The scream that pierced the Montana dawn would haunt Jake Mitchell for the rest of his life. But what came after that scream, what surrounded his ranch house at sunrise the next morning, would change everything he thought he knew about the land. He'd called home for 30 years. In the next 30 seconds, a wounded stranger would stumble onto his property carrying secrets that reached back generations, and Jake would make a choice that awakened something ancient in the wilderness around him. Jake was mending fence wire along his eastern boundary when he heard it, a sound of pure agony that cut through the morning air like a blade. His weathered hands froze on the pliers, every instinct sharpened by years of ranch life, telling him this wasn't the cry of an injured animal. This was human pain, raw and desperate, coming from somewhere near Willow Creek. He dropped his tools and ran toward the sound, his 55-year-old legs carrying him faster than they had in years. The creek ran along the edge of his property, separating his land from the vast wilderness that stretched toward the Blackfoot Reservation. In 20 years of living on this isolated ranch, he'd never had visitors from that direction. The creek might as well have been an ocean for all the contact he'd had with his neighbors to the east. What he found at the water's edge made his blood run cold. A young Native American woman, maybe 19 or 20, lay crumpled against the rocky bank. Her long black hair was matted with blood, and her left leg was bent at an angle that made Jake's stomach lurch. She was conscious but barely, her dark eyes unfocused with pain and shock. "Jesus," Jake breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. "What happened to you?" She tried to speak, but only a whisper escaped her lips. Jake leaned closer, straining to hear her words over the babbling of the creek. "They're coming," she managed, her voice barely audible. "Can't let them find me." Jake looked around instinctively, scanning the wilderness for signs of pursuit. The morning was still and quiet except for the creek and the distant call of a hawk. But something in the girl's eyes told him that whatever she was running from was real and dangerous. Without hesitation, Jake scooped her into his arms, careful not to jostle her injured leg. She was lighter than he expected, her small frame making her seem even younger than she probably was. As he carried her toward his truck parked near the fence line, she drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words in a language he didn't recognize. The drive back to his ranch house seemed to take forever, every bump in the dirt road drawing a whimper of pain from his passenger. Jake drove as carefully as he could while keeping one eye on the rearview mirror, watching for signs of whatever had put such fear in the girl's eyes. Inside his modest home, Jake laid her gently on the couch and assessed her injuries with the practical knowledge of a man who'd spent decades dealing with hurt animals and occasional ranch accidents. Her leg was definitely broken, probably a clean break, but serious enough to need professional medical attention. The head wound looked worse than it was. Scalp injuries always bled heavily, but it would need cleaning and stitches. As he worked to make her comfortable, Jake found himself studying her face. She had the kind of classical Native American features that spoke of ancient bloodlines, high cheekbones and strong jaw that suggested strength even in unconsciousness. But what struck him most was how young she looked, barely out of her teens and already carrying the weight of whatever trauma had brought her to his creek. The girl stirred as he finished cleaning her head wound, dark eyes fluttering open to meet his. Fear flickered there immediately, the instinctive wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust strangers. "Easy," Jake said softly, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." She studied his face for a long moment, those intelligent eyes taking in every detail. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than before, but still weak with pain. "Why are you helping me?" It was a question that cut straight to the heart of things. Jake paused in his work, considering his answer. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. Maybe it was the loneliness that had settled into his bones after his wife Sarah's death 3 years ago. Maybe it was the simple human decency that Sarah had always said was his best quality. Or maybe it was something deeper, a recognition of shared pain in the girl's eyes that reminded him of his own darkest moments. "Because you need help," he said finally. The girl nodded slowly, as if his answer satisfied some internal test. "My name is Kaya, Jake Mitchell. This is my ranch." Kaya tried to sit up, wincing as the movement sent pain shooting through her leg. "I can't stay long. When they find out where I went, who's looking for you?" But before Kaya could answer, exhaustion overtook her again. Jake watched her slip back into unconsciousness, her breathing evening out into the rhythm of deep sleep. He found himself reaching for the old blanket draped over the back of his recliner, the faded blue wool that Sarah had wrapped herself in during those last difficult months. Without really thinking about why, he spread it gently over Kaya's sleeping form. Outside, the Montana wilderness held its secrets close, and Jake Mitchell had no idea that his simple act of compassion had set something in motion that would bring the ancient world to his doorstep before another sun rose. Night fell over the Montana plains like a heavy curtain, bringing with it a silence that seemed deeper than usual. Jake Mitchell sat in his kitchen, nursing his third cup of coffee and stealing glances at the sleeping figure on his couch. Kaya hadn't stirred in hours, her breathing steady beneath Sarah's old blanket. But something about her presence had changed the entire atmosphere of his home. For 3 years, the ranch house had felt like a tomb, filled with memories and emptiness, in equal measure. Sarah's death from cancer had left Jake hollow, going through the motions of living without really being alive. But tonight, with a stranger sleeping in his living room, the house felt inhabited again. It wasn't comfort exactly, more like purpose. The sense that he was needed for something more than just feeding cattle and mending fences. A soft sound from the couch drew his attention. Kaya was awake, her dark eyes reflecting the dim light from the kitchen. She tried to sit up, moving carefully to avoid jarring her broken leg. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, her voice clearer now that some of the shock had worn off. "About 6 hours. You needed it." Jake moved to the living room, bringing a glass of water and some pain medication he'd found in his medicine cabinet. "How's the leg?" "Hurts, but I've had worse." Kaya accepted the water gratefully, studying Jake's face as she drank. "You said this was your ranch. How long have you lived here?" 20 years. My wife Sarah and I bought this place when we got married. Always planned to raise kids here, but..." Jake's voice trailed off, the familiar ache of loss settling in his chest. "What happened to her?" "Cancer. 3 years ago." Jake was surprised by how easily the words came. He rarely spoke about Sarah anymore, found it too painful to voice the emptiness she'd left behind. Kaya nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her eyes. "Loss changes the land around us, makes it feel different." It was an odd way to phrase it, but Jake found himself nodding. The ranch had felt different after Sarah died, as if the very earth had absorbed his grief and reflected it back at him. "What about you?" Jake asked. "What were you running from?" Kaya's expression darkened, and she pulled Sarah's blanket tighter around her shoulders. "There are men who think my family has something that belongs to them, something that's been ours for generations." "What kind of something?" "Land, sacred land." Kaya's voice carried a weight that spoke of old wounds and older injustices. "My great-grandfather's burial ground. It sits on what they claim is valuable mineral rights." Jake felt a familiar anger kindle in his chest. He'd heard stories like this before, seen how greed could drive men to terrible lengths. "So they're trying to force you off? They're trying to eliminate anyone who has a legal claim to contest their ownership?" Kaya met his eyes directly, and Jake saw something there that chilled him. "My brother was killed 2 weeks ago, shot while supposedly resisting arrest. My uncle disappeared 3 days later." The pieces began falling into place in Jake's mind. "And you're the last one. The last one with documentation. The last one who knows where the burial sites are located. Without me, they can claim the land. Was never formally occupied by tribal members." Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out into the darkness beyond his property. The night seemed to press against the glass, thick with unseen threats. How did you end up on my land? I was hiding in the foothills trying to make my way to the reservation. They found my camp yesterday morning. I ran, but they had horses, dogs. Kaya's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I fell down a ravine trying to get away, broke my leg on the rocks. I thought I was going to die there. But you made it to the creek. I crawled all night. I don't know how I made it that far. Kaya looked down at the blanket wrapped around her, running her fingers over the faded wool. This blanket, it feels old, important. Jake was quiet for a moment, surprised by her observation. It was my wife's. She used it during her treatments toward the end. Said it made her feel safe. She had strong medicine, your wife. I can feel it in the weaving. Again, an unusual way to phrase things, but Jake found himself believing her. Sarah had always been the spiritual one in their marriage, the one who believed in things beyond the physical world. She would have liked Kaya, he realized. Would have understood whatever it was the girl was trying to tell him. A sound from outside made them both freeze. The distant rumble of truck engines, still far away but getting closer. Kaya went rigid, her eyes wide with fear. They found me, she whispered. Jake moved quickly to the window, peering out into the darkness. He could see headlights in the distance, maybe 2 miles away, moving slowly along the county road that led to his property. Too many lights for a single vehicle. How many men are we talking about? Jake asked, his mind already working through. Defensive options, usually 6 or 7. They have police credentials, federal identification. Most people don't question them. Jake checked his watch. Almost midnight. All right, we've got maybe 10 minutes before they reach the house. Can you travel? Kaya tested her weight on her good leg, grimacing with pain, but managing to stand. I'll have to. But as Jake moved toward his gun cabinet, something stopped him. A feeling, subtle but insistent, like a whisper at the edge of consciousness. He looked back at Kaya, still wrapped in Sarah's blanket, and made a decision that defied logic. No, he said quietly, we're not running. Jake, you don't understand. These men will kill you without hesitation. Maybe, but I'm tired of running. From things. Been running from life for 3 years now. Jake settled back into his chair, his voice steady with newfound resolve. You said your great-grandfather's burial ground is sacred land. Well, this is my land, and sometimes a man has to make a stand. Outside, the headlights grew brighter, and Jake Mitchell prepared to face whatever came through his darkness. But neither he nor Kaya could have imagined what the dawn would bring, or how the ancient spirits of the land would answer his act of courage. The vehicle stopped just beyond the reach of Jake's porch light, their engines idling like predators, waiting to strike. Through the darkness, Jake could make out 3 trucks, black shapes against the star-filled Montana sky. Men emerged from the vehicles, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. 6 figures, maybe 7, spreading out to surround his house. Jake checked his rifle one more time, the familiar weight of the Winchester comforting in his hands. Beside him, Kaya had positioned herself near the kitchen window, her injured leg propped on a chair, but her eyes alert and watchful. That's them, she whispered, pointing to a tall figure stepping into the edge of the light. The one in front is Marcus Reed. He's the one who killed my brother. Jake studied the man through his window. Reed looked like a federal agent, clean-cut and professional, but there was something cold about his movements that spoke of violence held barely in check. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to getting his way through. Intimidation and force. Reed's voice cut through the night air, amplified by the stillness. Jake Mitchell, we know you have the girl. Send her out and there won't be any trouble. Jake stepped onto his porch, rifle cradled in his arms, but not pointed directly at anyone. The night air was crisp against his face, carrying the scent of sage and distant snow from the mountains. Evening, gentlemen, Jake called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Little late for a social call, isn't it? This is federal business, Mitchell. The girl is wanted for questioning in connection with terrorist activities. Jake almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Kaya, barely out of her teens and nursing a broken leg, labeled a terrorist. That's so. She doesn't look much like a terrorist to me. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Reed stepped closer, his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. Hand over the girl and you can go back to your quiet ranch life. And if I don't? Reed's smile was cold enough to freeze water. Then you become an accessory to terrorism. That's a federal crime, Mitchell. Lot of years in prison for helping enemies of the state. Jake felt something shift inside him, a resolve that had been building since he'd found Kaya by the creek. Maybe it was the loneliness of the past 3 years. Or maybe it was Sarah's voice whispering in his memory about standing up for what's right. But mostly, it was the simple recognition that some lines couldn't be crossed without losing your soul. Well, Reed, Jake said, raising his rifle just enough to make his intentions clear. I reckon that makes this a standoff. The night seemed to hold its breath. Jake could feel the weight of 7 men's attention focused on him, calculating odds and distances. Behind him, through the open door, he could hear Kaya moving quietly, preparing for whatever came next. You're making a mistake, old man, Reed called out. You think 1 rifle against 7 men is good odds? I think a man's got to draw the line somewhere, Jake replied, and I'm drawing mine right here. What happened next surprised everyone, including Jake. A sound began to rise from the darkness beyond the vehicles, a low rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. At first, Jake thought it might be more engines, more men arriving to tip the scales even further against him. But as the sound grew closer, he realized it was something else entirely. Hoofbeats. Dozens of them, moving through the night with purpose and coordination that spoke of something beyond mere coincidence. Reed and his men heard it too, their confident formation beginning to waver as they turned toward the approaching sound. The rumbling grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround them completely. Then they appeared at the edge of the light. Wild horses, their coats gleaming in the starlight, emerging from the darkness like spirits made flesh. A magnificent stallion led them, his coat so black it seemed to absorb the light around him. Behind him came mares and colts, at least 30 animals moving with silent grace through the night. What the hell? One of Reed's men muttered, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. The horses didn't charge or threaten, they simply moved into position around the ranch house, forming a loose circle that encompassed Jake's property while staying well clear of the armed men. The black stallion positioned himself directly between Jake's porch and Reed's position, his dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human. Kaya appeared in the doorway behind Jake, Sarah's blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. When she saw the horses, her breath caught in her throat. "Grandmother," she whispered so softly only Jake could hear. "Your grandmother?" Jake asked quietly, not taking his eyes off the extraordinary scene unfolding before him. "She used to tell me stories about the spirit horses, the ones who protect sacred ground. I thought they were just legends." Reed and his men were backing toward their vehicles now, their earlier confidence shattered by the surreal sight of wild horses materializing from the darkness. The animals made no aggressive moves, but their presence was undeniably intimidating. 30 horses, moving with coordinated purpose, created a natural barrier that no sane man would want to challenge. "This isn't over, Mitchell," Reed called out, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "We'll be back." "You do that," Jake replied, "but next time maybe you should consider that some things are worth more than money." The vehicles retreated into the night, their headlights disappearing over the horizon. But the horses remained, settling into a protective formation around the ranch house as if they intended to stay. The black stallion stood sentinel near the porch, his presence both magnificent and somehow familiar. Jake looked at Kaya, who was staring at the gathered horses with tears streaming down her face. "They came because of the blanket," she said softly. "Because of your wife's medicine mixed with the old ways. The spirits recognize when sacred things are used with pure hearts." As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Jake Mitchell realized that his simple act of wrapping a wounded stranger in his dead wife's blanket had awakened something ancient and powerful. And tomorrow's sunrise would bring revelations that would change not just his understanding of the land he'd called home, but his understanding of the invisible connections that bind all living things together. The sunrise that broke over the Montana plains was unlike anything Jake Mitchell had ever witnessed. As the first rays of light touched the horizon, the horses that had surrounded his ranch house throughout the night began to move in perfect synchronization, their hooves creating a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the earth itself. Jake stood on his porch beside Kaya, both of them transfixed by the sight unfolding before them. The black stallion that had led the herd raised his magnificent head toward the rising sun and released a call that echoed across the plains, wild and ancient, and filled with a power that made the hair on Jake's arms stand up. "Do you see it?" Kaya whispered, her voice filled with awe. At first, Jake didn't understand what she meant. Then, as the sunlight grew stronger, he began to notice something extraordinary. The horses weren't just randomly positioned around his property. They had formed a perfect circle, and within that circle, the morning light was revealing patterns in the earth that he'd never noticed before. Subtle depressions in the grass, barely visible, but unmistakably deliberate. "Sacred sites," Kaya explained softly. "Burial mounds. Your ranch sits on one of the most important spiritual grounds in this entire region." Jake felt the world shift beneath his feet. "But how is that possible? I've lived here for 20 years. I would have known. The spirits hid them, protected them, until someone worthy came along." Kaya pulled Sarah's blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Your wife, she knew, didn't she? Even if she didn't understand what she was feeling." Jake's mind raced back through memories of Sarah, remembering how she'd always insisted on certain spots on the property where she liked to sit and think. Places where she said she felt closest to something larger than herself. Places that, he now realized, corresponded exactly to the patterns the horses were revealing. She used to say the land spoke to her, Jake said quietly. "I thought it was just her way of talking about loving the ranch. She was sensitive to the old medicine. That's why the blanket carries such power. She poured her love and her connection to this sacred ground into every fiber." Kaya looked at Jake with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom. "When you wrapped me in it, you weren't just offering shelter. You were offering protection blessed by the spirits of this land." The sound of approaching vehicles broke the spell of the moment. Jake tensed, expecting Reed and his men to return with reinforcements. But instead of the black trucks from the night before, he saw a convoy of tribal police vehicles and several cars he didn't recognize. The lead vehicle stopped near his gate, and an elderly Native American man emerged. He was tall and dignified, with silver hair braided with eagle feathers and a face that carried the weight of years and wisdom. Behind him came other tribal members, men and women of various ages, all moving with the same purposeful dignity. "That's Grandfather William," Kaya said, her voice filled with relief and respect. "He's the spiritual leader of our people. If he's here, it means the horse's message was received." Grandfather William approached the porch with measured steps, his eyes taking in the circle of horses and the patterns they had revealed. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime serving as a bridge between worlds. "The spirits have chosen this place to make themselves known," he said to Jake, "and they have chosen you as their guardian." "I don't understand," Jake replied, though part of him was beginning to. "Your wife's spirit joined with the ancient spirits of this land when she passed. Her love for you and for this place created a bridge between the old ways and the new." "Grandfather." William gestured toward the horses, who remained in their protective formation. "When you offered shelter to Kaya, when you wrapped her in the blanket that held your wife's medicine, you completed a circle that has been waiting 20 years to close." One of the tribal police officers approached with news that changed everything. Grandfather, we've received word from the FBI. Marcus Reed and his entire operation have been arrested. Turns out they were using forged federal credentials and had no legal authority whatsoever. The real federal agents have been tracking them for months. Kaya sagged with relief, the fear that had driven her for weeks finally beginning to lift. It's over? It's over, the officer confirmed. Your family's burial ground will be protected under federal law. No mining or development will ever be allowed on sacred sites. As the morning progressed, Jake learned that his ranch sat at the center of a network of sacred sites that stretched across 3 counties. The horses, Grandfather William explained, were the guardians of these places, appearing only when the spiritual balance of the land was threatened or when a significant change was needed. What happens now? Jake asked, looking out at the horses, who still surrounded his property. Now you have a choice, Grandfather William said. You can continue to live here as you have, or you can accept the responsibility the spirits have offered you. Become a true guardian of this sacred ground, working with our people to protect and preserve it for future generations. Jake thought of Sarah, of the loneliness that had consumed him since her death, of the sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. He looked at Kaya, still wrapped in the blanket that had somehow bridged 2 worlds, and at the magnificent horses that had appeared from the darkness to answer a call he didn't even know he'd made. I accept, he said simply. The black stallion seemed to hear his words. The magnificent animal approached the porch and lowered his great head in what could only be described as a bow. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the horses began to move away, dispersing back into the wilderness with the same silent grace they had shown in arriving. But the black stallion paused at the edge of the light, looking back at Jake with eyes that held intelligence and something that might have been approval. Then he too disappeared into the Montana morning, leaving behind only hoofprints and the promise that they would return when needed. As the weeks that followed would prove, Jake Mitchell's life had indeed changed forever. His ranch became a meeting place where tribal elders and spiritual leaders came to perform ceremonies and maintain the sacred sites. Kaya, her leg healed and her family's legacy secured, became a regular visitor, teaching Jake about the old ways and helping him understand his role as guardian. The loneliness that had consumed him after Sarah's death transformed into a sense of connection to something larger than himself. He realized that Sarah had been preparing him for this moment all along, that her love for the land and her spiritual sensitivity had been guiding him toward a purpose he couldn't have imagined. And sometimes, in the early morning hours, when the mist rose from the creek and the wind carried whispers from ancient times, Jake would see the horses on the horizon, standing silent sentinel over the sacred ground they all protected together. Sarah's blanket still rested on the back of his chair, but now it felt different. Not like a memento of loss, but like a bridge between worlds, a reminder that love transcends death and that some connections run deeper than the eye can see. In protecting a wounded stranger, Jake Mitchell had found his way back to life, and the land, the horses, and the spirits of those who had gone before welcomed him home. What an incredible journey through the mystical American West. If this story of spiritual awakening, sacred land, and the mysterious connection between worlds moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another amazing tale. Drop a comment below and tell us what you thought about Jake's transformation from a lonely rancher to a spiritual guardian. Have you ever experienced a moment where you felt connected to something larger than yourself? What other stories of mysterious encounters and spiritual awakenings would you like us to explore? Your support means everything to us, and every like, share, and comment helps us continue creating these powerful stories that celebrate the hidden connections between all living things. Until next time, keep your eyes open for the magic that surrounds us every day, and remember that sometimes the most profound changes come from the simplest acts of compassion.